obsessed conglomeration of Christian misfits. The Believer gave it that title. My original title was A Primer for Exorcism. And you'll see why. My mother was 5 months pregnant with me when William Friedkin's film The Exorcist opened in 1973. By most accounts, the scariest film ever made, The Exorcist terrorized my mother so thoroughly that she thought she would go into labor and spontaneously expel me onto the theater floor. Two lukewarm Catholics of modest education, recently married and poised to begin a family, my parents were the perfect targets of a film about demonic possession. They had heard enough about Sunday sermons to take seriously the presence of Satan in the world, and yet knew less about the mythological underpinnings of all religion, the innate, perpetual tendencies that cause humans to behold in their own backyards a clash between the forces of light and darkness. Joseph Campbell once quipped that the difference between a believer and a non-believer is that the latter has not confused a metaphor with a fact. And so my parents were a confused pair. Thanks to savvy news channels, those years from the late 1960s to the mid-1990s saw an American upsurge in Satan stories. We're sober people now. Anyone in the year 2009 who still believes that Satan takes up residence in the bodies of young girls or plays guitar in a metal band needs either a science teacher or a psychiatrist. But my mother nearly gave birth to me in a movie theater in 1973 because the convincing horror of The Exorcist, in concert with a little hum of national paranoia, made her believe. She went to the theater wanting fear, and fear is what she got. There's just one problem. The Exorcist isn't scary. Can't be, maybe scary, not even a little. I watched the movie for the first time only recently. Strange that I'd never been even mildly curious about the movie that almost filched me from the womb prematurely. And yes, perhaps I harbored my own trifling dread that the film did indeed wield the power to spook a life. I was, after all, a child of Roman Catholicism, leaned on drama, ritual, hocus pocus, and flesh fetishism that for eons have made Catholicism an attractive option for those who crave pageantry. My hard-won reason almost always has a difficult time fending off an easeful inclination toward the sensational and improbable Sasquatch, UFOs, the Loch Ness Monster, the Kraken. Remember gullible Fox Mulder from the X-Files? Yes, he had hanging behind his desk a poster of a UFO hovering above a landscape, the words, "I want to believe," in bold across the top. And that's me, wanting to believe. But if I felt any trepidation at all about the infamous force of The Exorcist, about my own penchant for wanting to believe while I watched the most terrifying film in history, that trepidation evaporated about 25 uneventful minutes into it. Much of that infamous force stems from someone's assertion that the film is based on true events, an assertion tantamount to claiming that Star Wars 2 is based on true events. Perhaps because I came of age in the mid-1980s when the media-fed satanic cult craze was at its zenith, I understood evil to be, more terrifyingly, the work of average psychopaths. When I was 10 years old, police discovered a child my age in the next town who had been murdered by a step-parent. The adult had pounded 8-inch nails into the child's skull with a cooking pot. He was now claiming that Satan had taken charge of his soul. The story shook me, trailed me for weeks afterwards, and I've never forgotten those facts. The 8-inch nails, the pot instead of a hammer. One's definition of hell and evil influence one's reaction to The Exorcist. Inevitably, one's education plays a starring role here. I attended Catholic grade school, yes, but once I reached adolescence, I, for some reason, put myself on a diet of secular books and then began to understand all my religious texts as strictly allegorical. Here's what my Catholic education did not teach me about hell and evil, but what anyone with a spare month can learn from Jeffrey Burton Russell's magisterial 4-volume study of the history of the concept of radical evil as embodied by the devil. The book of Daniel makes the first reference to hell as a dominion of reprimand, a concept embellished only slightly throughout the New Testament until you come to a sinister comic book called Revelation, where the idea turns grandiose. Of course, Revelation has nothing at all to say about the future, but rather concerns the time in which it was written, a time when Jews were mightily persecuted by monolithic Rome. The number 666, what John calls the mark of the beast, and never mind that John didn't even write this final chapter, has not even a strand of spittle to connect it to Satan. 666 is the numerical equivalent of a certain someone's name, a madman more horrifying than any prince burst free from the mouth of hell. Anybody know his name? Nero. Check a biography if you doubt it. Edward Champlin's Nero paints an expert portrait of lunacy. And Dante's Inferno is as political as Revelation. The book was penned by a pissed-off poet in exile from his beloved Florence. His hell teems with hated rivals, with those bastards who drove him from the epicenter of Italian culture. So, the first hint of Hades as a place of punishment might appear in Daniel, but the Hebrew abode of the dead, Sheol, is as different from the Christian hell as Boston is from Topeka. The book of Isaiah makes clear that Sheol is synonymous with separation from God, with an afterlife that spares neither the wicked nor the righteous. St. Augustine, Christ emulator extraordinaire, would give a nod to the Hebrew progenitors of Christianity by defining evil the same way, total estrangement from God. It was the profoundly mixed up Augustine who, in City of God, turned Christianity so rabidly anti-flesh, damning generations of curious pre-weds to a perpetuity of hell's heat. Leave it to a former debaucher to wreck things for the rest of us. Furthermore, early Protestantism was as anti-sex and evil happy as its founder, Martin Luther, an admirable and iconoclastic gent who was otherwise the most devil-obsessed mister ever born. At some point, a league of those Protestants turned a bit wackier and then gave themselves a new name, Puritans. And guess where those Puritans pitched their tent? They landed in the USA, toting devil fear and sex aversion. Their poetical boss, Jonathan Edwards, would have been locked away in a mental institution if only he had been born a few years later. Instead, flocks of entertainment-starved ignoramuses trekked multiple miles in atrocious weather in order to hear Edwards spew forth with great flair about hell and the quickest way to get there. Read just a few segments of his track, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and you will see a masterful amalgam of sanctimony, sincerity, and bullshit. Now, fast forward to the Salem witch trials. What does any of this have to do with the terrifying power of The Exorcist, or with the fact that the film was only one of a trio of great devil flicks, sandwiched between Rosemary's Baby in '68 and The Omen in '76? Almost everything. Those weird American years from the late '60s to the mid-'90s were